I think it's about time I did this. In my last video, I explained the concept of the family resemblance, and this was the fourth time I explained it in my videos, in order to debunk a certain fallacy used by the anti-liberal, regressive left. So instead of doing it again and again, I'm just going to make one video explaining it, a video I can refer to. The rest of you content creators are welcome to refer to it as well. And, on top of that, I'm going to give a name to that regressive fallacy, so we can have something to identify it by. So, let's make some definitions. If we want to understand where this regressive tactic comes from, we first need to talk about essentialism. Essentialism is basically the belief that every entity has an attribute, or a set of attributes, that is essential to its identity, and without which it would lose that identity. Aristotle, the first man to formalize Western logic, posited that every entity has substances that are inherent to it, and every such substance makes it a member in a category shared with other entities that have that substance. Essentialism believes that while members of a category might differ from each other in many of their attributes, they all must have that substance, that essential attribute. Otherwise, they are not part of that category, even if they share many other attributes with its members. This is the approach that dominated Western logic from Aristotle on. But everyday language, for some reason, refused to adhere to the strict rules of logic. Philosophers throughout the ages were frustrated by the fact that people would use terms freely, and mean different things at different times when using the same term. Many philosophers believe that this is one of the things that prevent us from living a truthful life, and that if we just cleaned up our language of all of this ambivalence, we will solve a lot of our problems. The attempts to create a better language reached their peak at the beginning of the 20th century, with a movement that was called logical positivism, which tried to use logic to create a language that can better represent reality. The masterpiece book written in this effort was the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in 1921, and written by a young Austrian philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. With the Tractatus, Wittgenstein came the closest to producing a perfect language, a language that can describe the world without any ambivalent terms. But Wittgenstein himself was not satisfied. The more he grew older, the more he felt that there was something very wrong with this language. He started to claim that perfect languages, like logic and mathematics, may be beautiful in their purity, but they are not suitable to dealing with the complexities of daily life. In the 1953 book Philosophical Investigations, published posthumously, Wittgenstein compares the language he created in the Tractatus to pure crystal, but, he adds, this purity made it useless in the real world. It is like a ground with no friction, and because of that, a ground we can't walk on. Therefore, we need to stop trying to create a perfect language, and realize that our everyday language evolved to be the best language that there is to deal with daily life in the world. Wittgenstein, then, rejects the old idea that we need to clean our everyday language from ambivalences and create a perfect language. Everyday language is basically alright just the way it is. Instead, the book tries to clean everyday language from the idealist notions put into it by philosophers, and which cause us to have an idealized view of the world. One of the notions he goes after is essentialism. In aphorism 66 of Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein writes, "Consider for example the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say there must be something common, or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is something common to all. For if you look at them you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. Look for example at board games, with their multifarious relationships. Now pass to card games. Here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out, and others appear. When we pass next to ball games, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. Are they all amusing? Compare chess with noughts and crosses. Or is there always winning and losing, or competition between players? Think of patience. In ball games there is winning and losing, but when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Look at the parts played by skill and luck, and at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. Think now of games like Ring a Ring a Roses. Here is the element of amusement, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? And we can go through the many other groups of names in the same way, can see how similarities crop up and disappear. And the result of this examination is, We see a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing, sometimes overall similarities, sometimes similarities of detail. What Wittgenstein is telling us is that because of the essentialist tradition, we have come to expect that members of a certain category must all have at least one attribute in common. So when we think of the category of games, we expect that we would find an attribute that is common to all games. But when we look into it, we realize that there is no such attribute. Instead, we find that every game shares many attributes with every other game, but those are different attributes each time. Wittgenstein uses the term family resemblance to describe this type of similarity between members of the same category. Wittgenstein equates every language to a game, obeying certain rules. However, our everyday language is not one language game, but a combination of numerous language games. These language games will share the same words and terms, but they might have a different meaning, as the meaning is derived from the rules of the specific language game. But the human mind is flexible enough to navigate between these language games and understand the different meanings, and it is this flexibility that allows us to deal with the complex reality of human life. So the attempt to impose a rigid, one-dimensional language game on our everyday language is a fool's errand. Like he said, we need the friction. We need this multidimensional language, with all its ambivalences and imperfections. Now, in some language games, a more rigid essentialist approach is called for. Let's take a hypothetical case. Say that we discover a liquid that is like water in every way. It is transparent, it boils at 100 degrees Celsius, it has the same specific gravity, it has the same effect on our body when we drink it, etc. Except for one thing, its molecular formula is not H2O. Is it water? Well, it will probably be marketed as water, and humans will consume it and call it as such. But the chemist will disagree, because in the language game of chemistry, water is rigidly defined as H2O. Who is right? Everybody. The chemist is right within the rules of chemistry, and the people calling it water are right within the rules of everyday language, in which the language of chemistry is just one of many languages we use. In my last video, I claimed that the categories of man and woman cover a large variety of different cases, grouped together by the concept of family resemblance. Some commenters objected, and said that there are two reproductive systems that define them. Alright, but what about a man who is born infertile? Is he not a man? What if a woman has a hysterectomy? Does she stop being a woman? The answer in both cases is no, because they still have many other attributes that define their sex and gender. Those who try to defend the essentialist view would say that these are abnormal cases, and an infertile human is damaged. Well, this holds only if we are in a language game that believes it is essential for humans to procreate. In our everyday language, we value people by many different things, not necessarily by their ability to procreate. So to say that these people are damaged is wrong. Traditionally, human society used to hold essentialist views about many things, and did indeed define some people as abnormal when they were lacking the essence. But the liberal society of today has adopted a non-essentialist view. We do not judge individuals as unacceptable just because they are atypical to their category. As long as their divergence doesn't prevent them from functioning in everyday life, or cause them to harm themselves or others, they are accepted as normal. Instead of normal, we speak of normative. The typical members of a category determine what is normative to that category, whereas the atypical members, while there is nothing wrong with them, are not normative. And this is what the regressive left is trying to exploit in order to undermine our liberal society. The regressive tactic is simple. First, they pretend that society has an essentialist perception of a certain category of people, and portray themselves as those who are fighting against this essentialist view. This allows them to claim that science is on their side, because science does indeed show us that we cannot impose essentialist categories on the natural diversity of humans. And so, they can present themselves as debunking that straw man of essentialism that they themselves have erected. However, where I countered the essentialist position by relying on the family resemblance concept, which allows me to keep believing in categories even without an essence, the regressives claim that the absence of an essence proves that those categories are merely a social construct. Exploiting the ignorance of naive laymen, who are unaware that you can define categories in a non-essentialist way, they can then manipulate the discourse around the subject. Once they establish the idea that it is a social construct, they claim that what is considered normative is not the result of what humans typically are by nature, but something that was imposed on us to construct us in a certain way. Thus, they can portray liberal society as oppressive and undermine it. In my previous video, I described in detail how this is done with gender. I analyzed how the regressive left is employing this tactic to portray contemporary society as ruled by what they call the cis-normative, a social construct that says that men and women should behave only in a certain way, thus creating what they call the gender binary. I showed how they are fooling confused kids, who fall outside of this alleged binary, into believing that the cis-normative is oppressing them, because it puts pressure on them to conform to the norm. Once they convince them that they are oppressed, they turn them into pawns in the ideological battle to undermine liberal society. I mentioned Professor Jordan Peterson, who is leading the fight against these regressives, and I showed part of a TV debate, which by now is not the most famous TV debate he was in. Anyway, in that debate his main rival was Dr. Nicholas Matt, a lecturer in gender studies. Right off the bat, Matt comes out with this assertion.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex, and I'm a historian of medicine. I can unpack that for you at great length if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't. So that's a very popular misconception.
Matt never gets around to explaining what he means by that, but it is quite obvious. He pretends that biological sex is defined rigidly, in a way that sees certain biological components as essential and belonging to only one of the sexes. Science has shown that this is not the case, that the male biology contains components that are associated with the female sex, and vice versa. It is rather the amount of these components in our body that determines if we are male or female. But we are still male or female according to science. But not according to Dr. Matt, who pretends that biological sex can only be defined in an essentialist way, so he denies its existence, and even has the temerity to claim that science is on his side.
It's not my view, I just know that for over 50 years scientists have shown that that's not true.
On the basis of this claim, he can argue that the cis-normative is nothing but a social construct, which is excluding certain individuals, and thus oppresses them.
Cis-normative is basically the very popular idea and assumption that most people probably have, and definitely that our structures convey, that there is such a thing as male and female, that they connect to being a girl or a boy or a man or a woman, and then sometimes that will also recognize intersex or trans people or transsexual people, as you mentioned, because that's sometimes also referred to as a gender binary. So anything that fits within a gender binary can work within cis-normativity. Okay. But cis-normativity is basically that everyone assumes that there is male and female, and so very little is actually looked at to understand what's actually the case.
Dr. Matt behaves like such a weasel during this debate that I've decided that he deserves to have this fallacy named after him. So, I hereby christen it the Nicholas Matt fallacy, or the Matt fallacy for short. Let's define it officially. The stages of the Matt fallacy are as follows. 1. Create a strawman by pretending that, in liberal society, a certain category of people is rigidly defined in an essentialist manner. 2. Cite scientific research to show that when we look into it, we see that this essentialist definition fails. 3. Claim that this proves that this category isn't based on nature, and is therefore completely a social construct. 4. Conclude that the category is imposed on us, and creates a normative that is oppressing certain individuals or groups. 5. Use this to portray liberal society as oppressive. The way to debunk this fallacy, as I have shown, is to explain that you don't need an essence to define a category. A category can be defined based on Wittgenstein's family resemblance principle, and in fact, this is how contemporary liberal society does define categories of people. Thus, the category is not a social construct based on human nature, and the normative is simply determined by how humans typically are by nature. Therefore, as long as it allows the atypical people to express their nature, the normative is not oppressive. We can find the Matt fallacy employed in other places as well. Long before he became famous for his stance on the non-binary gender issue, Jordan Peterson took part in another TB debate, about the difference between the male and female brain. His rival this time is Daphna Joel, a professor of psychology, who claims that there is no such thing as a male brain and female brain.
Could you make that case for our viewers, please?
Yes, so it's a little more complex than this. So there are differences between the brains of males and brains of females, group differences, and you can see many differences actually, and we've seen them. But what you can see is a typical male brain and a typical female brain in an actual human being. So there is no person that has only male characteristics or only female characteristics. Each one of us has both characteristics that are more prevalent in males and characteristics that are more prevalent in females. In this sense, there are no male brains and female brains, although everyone has a brain.
And what did you call it when you see both of those?
Right, mosaic. So each one is an individual mosaic of both features that are more prevalent in males and features that are more prevalent in females. Usually people are surprised because no one is thinking about this way. So usually we just list sex differences and we assume that sex differences add up. So the more differences we found, we believe that the sexes are more and more different. And what we've seen, and no one has looked at it before, is that the sex differences are not consistent. So you can be extremely on the male side on some features and extremely on the female side on other features.
So basically, Joel shows us that nature perfectly matches Wittgenstein's description. There is no attribute that is unique or essential to the male or female brain, but there are attributes that are more typical to each one of the sexes. A brain that has more feminine attributes is a female brain, according to the family resemblance principle. But since Joel pretends that only an essentialist definition can hold, she claims that this shows that there is no such thing as a female brain. And based on that, she can claim that the gender roles in our society are not based in our nature, but are a social construct.
So the problem is, again, our social structure, which reinforces and creates these differences. Whether in a gender-neutral society we will still have these differences, no one knows. I don't know. Maybe there will be differences. But why do we care about them? Why, as a society, we are built to create or to enlarge these so-called natural differences? This is my question, and I'm keeping asking it, but I think this is the main question.
To her credit, Joel isn't fanatic in a social constructionism. She admits that there is a possibility that nature plays a role. But her ideological bent keeps driving her to try and deny throughout the debate and emphasize the role of nurture. By using the Matt fallacy to deny the existence of a male and female brain, she can pretend that nature plays no part. Even though Professor Peterson does not hold an essentialist position when he argues for difference between the sexes, she is seemingly incapable of getting the point. One of Professor Joel's main arguments is that her rival's claims are ideologically and politically motivated. She claims that we are obsessed with trying to find biological differences between the sexes, so that we can justify the different gender roles in society. She is completely oblivious to the fact that there is an opposing ideological movement, which claims that the gender roles are a construct of an oppressive society, and that her arguments stem from this radical ideology. The result, as usual with regressives, is that she is delegitimizing the arguments of those who are trying to fight against this radical anti-liberal ideology. Although she doesn't go as far as Nicholas Matt, who accused Peterson of hate speech, she does imply that his position stems from bigotry.
I think we should not be obsessed by the question. Are we obsessed by the question whether there is an essential difference between people with light skin color and dark skin color? Are we obsessed with this? This is not politically legitimate to even ask this question, is it? So why is it legitimate to ask the question whether males and females are fundamentally different? And I think the only reason to ask this question, and this is why we are obsessed with it, is we want to say that there are natural differences, because this justifies the different treatment of males and females in our society.
This debate took place in 2015, and Joel could still say that it is unthinkable to inquire about natural differences between races. Today, with the rise of race realism, the unthinkable became very thinkable. Some of you are probably already wondering how what I've delineated here pertains to race realism. So let's now turn to that. When we come to talk about race realism, the first thing we need to point out is that it is not rigidly defined. It is rather a vague term, which can only be understood through the principle of family resemblance. It means different things to different people. At the most basic level, it is a reaction to regressive leftists who posit that the existing racial categories have no basis in biology. Using the Matt fallacy, they claim that race is a social construct, constructed by a racist society to justify the oppression of one ethnicity by the other. According to the regressives, the fact that some ethnicities do better than others proves that Western society suffers from systemic racism. In reaction, the race realists claim that race is real, meaning that people of different color, when looked at as a group, display differences on the biological level to the point where you at least have to consider the possibility that these differences may account for their different social status. And the science, on this, is on the side of the race realists. But then, some race realists interpret race realism to mean that race is not only real, but is the most defining feature that we have. They assert that we should construct our identities around our race, because our biology is somehow more real than anything else. This is a weird argument, since culture is obviously more important than biology in determining one's identity. Actually, I see no reason why we should regard race as identity at all. Ethnicities are identities, since every ethnic group has its own beliefs, its own customs, its own shared history, etc. And since humans tend to procreate within their own ethnic group, we will usually find that an ethnicity also has typical biological traits. But what makes the ethnicity an identity is not these biological distinctions, it's the shared cultural heritage. And there are some race realists who are taking the statement race is real a step further, and argue for an essentialist view of race. They are simply wrong. Race is real only if you view it through the principle of family resemblance. This demonstrates one of the dangers of the Matt fallacy. By employing it to race, and attempting to silence their opponents, the regressives have aided in the rise of the race realists. Many people are drawn to the race realist side because of the truthful part of it, but once they are on that side, they might be lured into adopting actual racist positions. Alright, the Matt fallacy has thus been defined and explicated. Feel free to start using the term. I think you will find it very useful in debunking regressive claims. Let's get to work.